Welcome to this explainer. We are jumping right into the high-stakes reality of decision-making in the age of AI today. We're going to look at a pretty fascinating breakdown of what happens when machines start making our absolute toughest business calls, and why your ultimate survival skill for this next decade of work, well, it isn't technical at all.
So, I want you to picture a boardroom. It's Tuesday afternoon, it smells faintly of someone's microwaved lunch, and everybody's shoulders have just dropped. The pens are capped. Mentally, people are already back at their desks. Why? Because the machine just confidently made a recommendation to kill a legacy product line, projecting a cool $3 million in savings. The decision was just handed to the room, completely pre-answered.
Which brings us to Section 1, the 94% trap. You know, there's this incredibly alluring trap when it comes to perceived mathematical certainty. In this specific boardroom scenario we're talking about, the AI model spat out a 94% confidence rating to kill off this unglamorous legacy product line. It was clean, it was fast, and honestly, that decimal place certainty made everyone mentally pack up and leave. I mean, think about it. When a machine hands you a 94% score, disagreeing with it feels a lot less like leadership and way more like ego, right?
But the executive in our case study, they were the only one who didn't relax. Instead, they actually held up the room during an agonizingly uncomfortable 30 seconds of silence. With 11 people just waiting for a simple nod of approval, they had to stop and ask, what hidden reality could this model not possibly see? What exactly is blind to the algorithm here?
Well, the answer was a plate of mediocre sea bass. Yep, you heard that right. See, about 8 months earlier, this executive had dinner with the procurement head of their second largest customer. And over that mediocre sea bass, the client casually let slip that the absolute only reason they stayed with the company, despite price hikes, despite outages, was because they still manufactured that exact, quote-unquote, unprofitable legacy product for their factory floor. The model perfectly optimized a spreadsheet line item, but it completely missed the human context. And this brilliantly illustrates the real danger we're facing. Because when they finally paused to trace that relationship thread, the one the model was totally blind to, the actual revenue at risk wasn't the $3 million the AI projected. No, it was a staggering $31 million tied up in relationships entirely reliant on that single unprofitable product. $31 million.
Let's move on to Section 2, custody versus authorship. Now, this brings us to a critical distinction that literally no corporate training program teaches you as you climb the ladder: the difference between doing the work and owning the outcome. We really have to separate authorship from custody. You can absolutely delegate the authorship, the math, the forecasting, the modeling, to a machine. Honestly, it does it better and way faster than any human analyst. But you can never, ever delegate the custody. Custody is the accountability for the real-world consequences when things go sideways. It's whose name is on the line and who's lying awake at night when that decision impacts real people.
Which leads us to Section 3, children of the magenta line.
To truly understand the sheer danger of giving up this custody in white-collar work, we actually have to step outside the office for a second and look into an airline cockpit. There's this famous, heavily discussed aviation concept called children of the magenta line. The magenta line is simply the route the flight computer draws on the navigation screen. And the big warning here is that commercial pilots can become so incredibly reliant on just managing that digital line that their actual physical flying skills completely atrophy from disuse.
This quote perfectly captures the tragic reality of Air France Flight 447. When the plane's airspeed sensors iced over, the autopilot did exactly what it was programmed to do, right? It disconnected and handed control back to the humans. The plane was perfectly flyable, but the crew, because their manual flying muscles had atrophied, tragically crashed it into the Atlantic. And right now, professionals in offices everywhere are losing their judgment muscles by just blindly waving through confident AI outputs. They're basically becoming white-collar children of the magenta line.
Okay, Section 4, routers, cowboys, and custodians. So let's look at the 3 distinct types of professionals navigating this highly automated boardroom reality. First up, we have the router. The router overrides absolutely nothing. They blindly trust the machine and just pass the output along to the next person in the chain. But make no mistake, the quiet economics of the next decade pretty much guarantee that routers are entirely optional. I mean, if your only job is passing along an AI's confident answer, you're going to be completely replaced by the AI itself.
On the flip side, we have the cowboy.
This is an extremely expensive liability of a leader who performs fake authority by overriding the AI on perfectly fine, easily reversible calls. They do this just to stroke their own ego, wanting the room to remember who's supposedly in charge. They dress vanity up as judgment, which, quite frankly, does far more damage to an organization.
So the crucial takeaway here is that you want to be the custodian. On a day-to-day basis, the custodian actually looks a lot like the router because they gladly delegate the easy, reversible math to the machine. But, and this is a big but, they fiercely hold on to their override capital for the hardest, completely irreversible calls where the AI is totally blind to human nuance.
As a leader, you also really need to beware of organizations creating what's called a moral crumple zone. This happens when a company claims to keep a human in the loop by just slapping a junior analyst in charge of the approve button. But if you give a junior employee zero actual authority to say no, they're really just there to take the blame, literally to crumple on impact, when the automated system inevitably fails. That is not governance. That's just manufacturing a scapegoat wearing a lanyard.
Let's move on to Section 5, when to hold the call.
So how does all this build into an actionable playbook? Well, here's your survival guide for knowing exactly when you need to step in. You only override the machine when decisions are one-way doors, meaning they're totally irreversible. You step in when the data is super thin or when the real value relies on off-the-spreadsheet human relationships, kind of like that dinner over sea bass we talked about earlier. You hold custody when there's a catastrophic downside hiding behind a high confidence score. And finally, you step in to protect the company's sheer organizational fairness and legitimacy. That's when you take the wheel.
And finally, Section 6, 5 reps to stay sharp. Look, just knowing that checklist isn't enough. You actually have to actively build this judgment muscle way before that crucial meeting ever happens. And you do this through 5 pretty straightforward routine repetitions. First, force the pre-mortem by making the model argue against itself to define exactly how it could be wrong. Next, physically write down the human consequences that the machine missed. When it is time to act, claim your override out loud in the room before knowing the outcome, not safely after the fact, right? Also, make sure to occasionally make calls manually without checking the AI first, just to practice flying the plane by hand. And lastly, honestly audit your own override log to make sure you aren't drifting into being a router or a cowboy.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, absolutely vital thought. These machines, they're only going to get more confident. The autopilot will always offer to fly. So, the big question is, will you let your critical judgment atrophy into nothing, or will you be the one who can still step up, hold custody, and actually take the controls when the autopilot fails?